McFleet, we are back with another episode of McFly's Movie House with me, your host, Marta McFly, and we have a very interesting episode lined up today. It's one that looks at traditional horror found in movies, but it also goes head to head with real life horrors that are so chilling and disturbing. It's a fascinating concept for a film, really, and that film happens to be Peter Bogdanovich's directorial feature film debut, 1968's Targets, starring the iconic Boris Karloff in one of his final roles. I am very excited to chat about this one today, but first things first, let me introduce my guest. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, then you know it is a returning guest. He is a filmmaker and content creator. I'm welcoming Bryan Starr to the podcast. So great to have you back, Bryan. How are you?
It is great to be back. I'm doing good. Thank
Yay.
you for having me. Very excited about this one today.
Good. Oh, you made me laugh when we were picking the topic for today's episode. I gave you a list of films and you immediately picked this one and you said something like, let's keep the motif going with movies I've made you buy and watch. So
Yes.
initially you came on for The Swimmer and now you're back for Targets. I would hope that you like this one as well.
Yeah. Yeah. What's funny is before The Swimmer was ever brought up, I bought Targets because of you. And so, yeah, when that was on the list, I was like, okay, yes, let's keep this going. This is perfect. And of course, gave me an opportunity to actually watch it and not just be a film that's, on the shelf, still in the
Sitting.
wrapper. So, yeah.
Did you buy the Criterion release? Because what happened with me was I bought this off
Oh,
of
yeah.
eBay, like I think a month before Criterion released the restoration. And I was so upset about that because this cover isn't nearly as good as the other one.
Yeah. It's
Oh,
good.
no. It's
It's
so
good.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta
Yeah.
get it. Oh,
And
amazing.
the
Well, I
sale,
want to
this is
hear.
the sale is happening right now.
I mean,
So
listen,
it's
this is
time.
now three for three, three episodes in a row practically. People keep bringing up this damn sale. In Canada, we don't have it through Barnes and Noble. So
Yeah.
I don't know, man. Maybe a full price purchase for me,
Sure. Yeah.
most likely. Well, I do want to hear your initial thoughts about the movie. But first things first, what have you bought recently and what do you suggest listeners and I check out? I always ask you about physical media since I know it's your jam.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Criterion Collection.
Yay!
The sale, I think, literally started yesterday. And
Yes.
so you are getting the first look at what has been purchased
Ooh.
before I post any video. I picked
Ooh.
up three
Mhm.
with my the tradition I like is I like to go at the beginning and then let them restock. And my birthday is July 14th, so I like going back around my birthday to pick up some more. So I'm never the one that's going out with a massive stack. I like to kind of stagger the sale. But I picked up three. One which we have talked about, but I got the 4K was for Del Toro's Pinocchio,
Ooh, yes.
which is just incredible. But I tend to not do 4K all of the time. But when it comes to animated, the better the quality, the better it looks, of course. And so Pinocchio deserved the 4K upgrades, whereas these other two,
Hmm.
Blu-ray's fine with me. I'm perfectly fine. For instance, I don't know, Train Spotting almost
Ooh,
needs to be in the grungiest looking way
yes,
possible. So I'm fine with the Blu-ray for Train Spotting, but
of
very
course.
excited to upgrade this from my DVD. And then I'm a big Terrence Malick fan, and I did not have the New World on Criterion. And this is just a
Ooh,
beautiful release. This is when Terrence Malick really started getting, some would say, too creative. I don't.
hmm.
I think he's brilliant. I love what he does with the camera, and the New Worlds is kind of the start of the modern Terrence Malick. And yeah, it's wonderful to have this. So those are the three I picked
Oh,
up literally yesterday.
I love that. Those are great picks. I obviously, like I said, I couldn't partake in the sale, but I noticed that Kino Lorber is doing a sale right now, which is
Yeah.
also quite good and a lot cheaper, if I may add.
Yes.
So if you have the
Yes.
time, I would maybe do that.
Yes. Absolutely.
But
For sure.
yes, so are you ready to chat about targets?
Yes. Let's do it. Very excited.
Amazing. Well, First of all, I want to hear your initial thoughts. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. I watched it today. I thought about doing it last night and I was getting a little tired and I want to put my full attention into it. So watched it this morning. It was how I started my day, which quickly made me realize, oh, this is a way to start the day. It's first off, it's wonderful. I couldn't believe it's an hour and a half long. It felt longer, not in a terrible way, but that's just how like tension is in this film. And yeah, I just, oh, by the way, I went into it completely blind. So I
Oh,
didn't
wow.
watch any trailers. I didn't read anything. You told me to buy it. I did. And then it sat on my shelf. And when it came time to record, I like to do the research after. So I went into it completely blind, having no idea what or who or when anything was going to happen. And very, very happy with purchasing this movie now because it really is just it really is something. And the fact that this is his directorial debut is also just like, my goodness, like the
Bonkers.
vision for this is insane. So yeah, thumbs up for me for sure.
Yay.
Yeah, great pick.
Good. Oh, I'm so glad. I mean, the same thing for me. The first time I saw this, I was floored. As you said, the fact that this was Bogdanovich's debut, although technically it wasn't his debut. Here's like a
Okay.
little side story, side quest,
Yeah.
if you will. He actually helped Roger Corman on Voyage to the Planet of the Prehistoric Women, which
Okay.
he's credited as under a pseudonym because he didn't want his name attached. But he
Sure.
directed the majority of that. But anyway, semantics. We can
Okay.
just say that this is his debut
Yeah, for
because we'll
sure.
chat about his career a bit here soon. But let me first give you a breakdown of what we're going to do. We're going to lay down some background info on Bogdanovich himself, then explain what Targets is about, highlight those themes he's presenting us with of old Hollywood versus new and what was going on in the film industry at the time. Then we'll chat about the real life event that inspired this film, which I'm sure you also looked into.
Yeah.
And then it's terrifying. And then get into some other stuff that came after the movie came out. And then I also want to highlight Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because I think that these two movies just make great companion pieces to one another. So, how
Yeah.
does that sound?
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing.
Sounds great.
Yay. So, Peter Bogdanovich, huge film buff. He was born in Kingston, New York in July 1939, passed away in January 2022. And he came from quite the artistic family. His father was a painter and pianist, I believe. And perhaps that's what sparked his creative streak, because when he was 12, Bogdanovich did what I like to call the prototype to Letterboxd. He actually started keeping a record of every film he ever saw in these little 4x6 cards, and he'd write reviews. And he started doing this in 1952 and continued it all the way to 1970. That's so cool, right?
That's crazy. Yeah.
I know. And so get this, he saw up to 400 films a year, which I mean, with what time? I'm at, I think, just over 200 right now. And that is
Yeah.
already like, I'm at my brink when it comes to weekly movie watches. But so he made these cards up until the point he did his second feature film, The Last Picture Show, which, by the way, fantastic movie. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, I really love The Last Picture Show, actually.
Yeah, I honestly, when I watched it, the premise of it, I was like, I don't know if this is going to be for me,
Mm,
but I was just hooked to that movie. I could not look away.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's something a modern film that I just recently
Mhm.
watched, The Bike Riders.
Oh, yeah.
There's just something about uh, like put a camera at a time and record is what some of these movies feel like. And I'm probably
Mhm.
using terrible verbiage there, but yeah, The Last Picture Show is just life and humanity, and yeah,
Yep.
I love it.
Yeah, me too. Oh, I'm so glad you're a fellow fan. But
Yeah.
yeah, so he was making these reviews and he would revise them if he saw the same film multiple times. And eventually, decades later, he started sharing these cards on his IndieWire blog, which was called, get this, Blogdanovich. Just
Of
let that
course,
sink
yeah.
in.
That's brilliant.
It's so good. It's sadly not up anymore, but I really wish it was. I wish I saw these cards, particularly in the early years of him making them, because I'd love to see his progression as a critic. Bogdanovich was notably, along with being a filmmaker, actor, writer, producer, he was also a film critic and film historian. And he started his career as a film critic for Esquire, Film Culture. He also contributed to Cahiers du Cinéma, iconic, all before becoming a filmmaker in his own right. And he also published so many books, including just interviews with Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Howard Hawks. I mean, this guy just kept busy and absorbed as much as he could from these legends. I just find all of this so fascinating because this was all like his school to how to
Mhm.
become a incredible filmmaker in his own right.
Yeah,
So clearly Bogdanovich had these inspirations of making it in the industry. And so to do so, because again, he was a critic, he would ask publicists for invitations to movie premieres and industry parties because he wanted to mingle and get his foot properly in the door. And so finally, at one specific screening, he sits down. Lo and behold, who's sitting behind him? None other than Roger Corman, who recognized Bogdanovich from his work as a writer for Esquire. And at the time, Corman was known to snag just really thirsty young filmmakers intent on breaking it in the biz. And he'd hire them to help him out with his projects. I mean, notably, he helped Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, anybody else you can think of that's like a huge name that he helped. I'm like drawing a blank right now.
not so much that, but obviously actors.
Hmm.
He was like, speaking of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, rewatching it and realizing that the hot actors today were in this was when did Once Upon a Time
Yes.
come out? But like,
2019, I think.
yeah, so Sydney Sweeney is showing up, and I'm like,
Yes.
and then Austin Butler, I completely forgot about, and then
Same.
not only Kevin Smith's daughter, but Maya Hawke is one of the four
Hmm.
people at the bottom of the hill. So Roger Corman, same thing.
Yeah.
Almost every actor that is a legend today probably was in a Roger Corman film.
Yeah, it's just it's mind-boggling. But I like that connection. I never even thought of that looking at Tarantino as like a I don't want to say modern Roger Corman, but I
Right.
mean, yeah, it's a similar vibe.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the thing with Corman was he usually wouldn't pay much, but people did it because they knew, I mean, it's Roger Corman, right? And the experience he'd give people was incredible. And if he really liked you, then I mean, Corman had power, he had pull. So Corman offers Bogdanovich work. And of course, he accepted right away. This was working as Corman's go to guy or assistant on 1966's The Wild Angels with Peter Fonda, which saw Bogdanovich suddenly directing second unit. And he later said of this experience that he went from getting laundry to directing the picture in 3 weeks. And he worked 22 weeks on that, just pre production, shooting, second unit, cutting, dubbing. He said he's never learned as much since. Anything you want to add here before I continue?
I can't imagine 3 weeks of PA work essentially, and then you're making your own movie. That's
Crazy.
insane. That is absolutely insane to me, especially this one. I can see like maybe lower budgets, single location, small cast, but targets is wild.
Yeah, so from what I understand, he rewrote the screenplay for The Wild Angels. That's what they were working on. And he helped with the directing at the end of the movie. And ultimately, the film cost 360,000 to make, grossed 15 million, which ended up being Corman's most successful film to date at that point. And clearly, Corman was impressed, and he
Mm.
decided to offer Bogdanovich an opportunity to direct his own movie, which ended up being Targets, and he would back him. But there were some conditions. Do you know them?
I do. Yes. Really great conditions, actually. I can't imagine someone coming up to me and saying, you get to make your first movie, here are your conditions, and the conditions being as iconic as using Boris Karloff,
Boris Karloff.
being one of them is just, whoa, okay, sold.
Yeah, exactly. So Boris Karloff owed Corman 2 days of work. So Corman told Bogdanovich he had to incorporate him. And I think he got Karloff for 20 minutes of the film. But then he also had to use footage of an old film that Corman directed and produced starring Karloff, and that was The Terror from 1963. I have not seen that in full. Have you?
No, I haven't.
No, but I'm very
It's on the
curious after
list.
this. Same.
Yeah.
And so, with the time that Corman owed Karloff and the screen time of showing The Terror in targets, that would be a total amount to 40 minutes of Karloff's screen time. And then the rest, Bogdanovich had free reign to make the story whatever he wanted. And so Bogdanovich wondered, how on earth do I incorporate this old Victorian horror into my own movie? And I think what he ended up doing was very, very clever, don't you?
Yeah, I love that's when I was reading that, I was like, oh my God. So from these two rules, essentially main two rules, he was able to build a story and obviously like inspired by true events. But yeah, it's brilliant to say that they're going to end up at a drive-in to show footage of the terror and creating one of the main characters to be Karloff. Yeah, I'm just very, very smart way of going about it for sure.
Fascinating. So Bogdanovich decides to start targets by opening the film with footage from The Terror. And then on top of that, he also decided to poke fun at Corman that Karloff's character hated The Terror because he thought it was outdated, which is so funny to me. And Corman, I guess, let it slide. But so that didn't solve the problem for the other half of the movie, which I'll explain shortly. And so Bogdanovich is thinking about it, and he's thinking about it with his then wife, Polly Platt, who co wrote Targets with him. And coincidentally, it was the editor of Esquire, Harold Hayes, who told Bogdanovich, well, why don't you make a movie about the mass shooter Charles Whitman? And then it clicked for Bogdanovich, why don't I make a movie about an actor like Karloff, who is well past his prime as a horror icon, and then have him cross paths with a character who represents modern horror, aka, real horror, a mass shooter. And so that's how the movie started, and it allowed Bogdanovich to easily use Karloff for not that much because he was blending two stories in one film. Yeah, I just find it fascinating how that came together.
Yeah, obviously, I'm sure movies have done it before, but
Mm,
essentially, what's going on is two separate storylines that obviously eventually merge, and it's done it's done really well. And again, and we're going to talk about this later, but similar things happening with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So anyone who hasn't seen Targets but has seen Once Upon a Time will kind of understand the multiple storylines that are set in the same city and almost have nothing to do with each other until finally things
they
kind of
do.
all come together. So yeah, it's really smart.
Exactly. So before we keep going, let's quickly describe the plot of Targets. I don't even think I did that yet. But I think this movie is so cool. It's also so chilling and unfortunately so timely today. For me, I thought it was a very unsettling watch. It really made me feel uncomfortable, and that's the point. So
Yeah.
the movie sees Boris Karloff playing a version of himself. His character's name is Byron Orlock, and Orlock is in LA, and he announces after watching that screening of The Tear that he's retiring. He's done. He thinks time is come and gone. He's over it because he believes that times are changing. And in a sense, he's right. Targets ends up being a phenomenal little historical piece as well because it highlights that shifting mentality of moviegoers at the time and what they found scary on screen because they weren't scared of his old movies anymore in the 60s. Frankenstein wasn't scary, The Mummy
Right.
wasn't scary. And so this younger crowd was more scared of reality and real life terrors of the world. I mean, rightfully so. And so, anyway, Orlock announces he's quitting, which distresses a young director who is played by Bogdanovich himself, Sammy Michaels. And he wants Orlock in one more movie of his that he wrote just for him. And anyway, Sammy and Orlock come to an agreement that Orlock will make one final appearance in LA, a promotional appearance at a drive in before finally leaving Hollywood. So that's one storyline. And then at the same time, we have a plot of the Charles Whitman esque character, Bobby Thompson, So, who is Bobby Thompson? Bobby Thompson is your unassuming, clean cut suburban man. Honestly, during this rewatch, I thought he looked a lot like Jesse Plemons. Can you see it?
That's funny. Yeah, yeah, I can definitely see that. Another thing too is, so first off, our introduction to this character is a scope on screen with Boris Karloff in the middle of that scope, cut to this character holding a sniper rifle, and the cheeriest guy who's so excited to have this gun.
Oof.
And again, me going into it completely blind, when I saw the scope, I was like,
Oh.
now, like right now, this is happening, and it wasn't. But seeing this kid, essentially, even though he's married in the film, he's a very young guy, cheerfully just kind of driving and eating a baby Ruth, and something is happening and nothing
Yeah.
is being explained. And what an incredible introduction to that character.
Yes. Also, I just realized when you said nothing is being explained, this is such a through line to all the movies that I make you watch.
Yeah.
Nothing is explained.
No,
So,
no. But
oh, I'm sorry, Brian.
I really love that. I really, watching some current TV today where I was just fed up with being treated like a kid because the like exposition was almost doubled and just shoved into my face. I love when things aren't explained, and
Mhm.
it's like watching a movie with a kid. A kid continues to have questions at every single turn,
Yes.
and sometimes you just got to say, just keep watching, just keep watching. It will be explained. But yeah, that's absolutely what's happening so far in this film for sure.
Absolutely. So, where was I? So, yeah, so Bobby lives with his mother and father and wife in the suburbs, as you said, and his family is just your normal American suburban family, which makes all of this so much more disturbing. And Bobby's very unstable. He's a gun collector, as you said. We first see him at a gun shop. That's our introduction to the character. And he goes shooting with his dad, and nobody notices that Bobby has these urges. He tries bringing it up with his wife, kind of, but he doesn't really tell her much. And lo and behold, one day, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, spoilers, but one day he murders his mother, his wife, a boy who is making, I think, like a milk delivery to his home.
Yeah.
And after that, he heads out, goes on this killing spree. First, on top of this, I think oil storage tank, that's what it was. Yeah, by the highway, before finally running from the cops into the drive in where Orlock is having that screening. And that's when their paths cross. As we said, we see that old Hollywood tear meets new Hollywood tear. And that's the film. Really chilling stuff. So, before we get into some info about Whitman in the movie, let's chat briefly a bit old Hollywood versus new. How familiar are you with the differences?
I don't know. I don't know if like I off the top of my head could just immediately go into talking about it.
Fair.
Not necessarily, I guess, a Hollywood historian.
Uh huh.
You lead the way, and
Okay.
I'll see where I
Well,
can chime in.
chime in wherever.
Yeah.
So, yeah, by the time the 1960s rolled around, this, let's call it glitzy yet conservative outlook to filmmaking was going out of style. Notably, actually, in 1948, there was a ruling of the US versus Paramount Pictures, where the Supreme Court finally put an end to major studios owning movie theaters. Now, why was this a problem up until this point? Because the studios which owned these theaters made their films be shown exclusively. So indie theaters weren't a thing. It was also harder to watch foreign films because of this. It was a problem. And so this ruling happened at the same time during the 1950s with the rise of television. Studios had to deal with that too. Audiences choosing to, stay home, watch TV. This younger generation also didn't jive with these older movies because, as we said, these older movies were more conservative. And so, why were they conservative? This was thanks to a thing called the Hays Code, which was, I mean, I think officially called the Motion Picture Production Code, but Hays Code. And this code was strict. It existed since the 1930s, and it was a set of guidelines that regulated what could be shown on screen and what couldn't. So, nudity, violence, drug use, adultery, this was all a no no. And if filmmakers wanted to show any of it or hint at it, they'd have to be careful. There was a lot of, hinting at things, let's say.
Yeah.
And so in the 60s, this was just really out of date. And the Hays Code was finally abolished in 1968. Since then, it was replaced with the system of age-based ratings that we have today. Side note, really quickly, have you watched pre-code movies, Bryan? Like notably pre-code horrors, because they were bananas
Sure.
before the Hays Code was introduced.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I think one of the most famous breakings of the code is Psycho just showing a toilet. I think it's a toilet flushing too, was like a big no-no. Yeah, so like the fact that we got that is like, yes, we've done it. We've broken the code or yeah, so
Yeah.
that's absolutely insane.
Oh, just crazy. And I mean, before we go on, I do want to note one very, very notable flop of old Hollywood. Do you know which film I'm talking about? I believe it's the last studio epic that came out during this era. Epic is your
No,
hint.
yeah, I mean, when I hear epic, I think Cleopatra and Ben-Hur,
That's the
but I
one,
don't. Okay,
Cleopatra.
okay,
So, yeah,
okay,
so it was 1963's Cleopatra. Massive budget, massive stars. Elizabeth Taylor was notably Cleopatra. But so these sorts of epics were really going out of style. And that movie
sure.
was a flop. Visually a spectacle. You've seen it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's massive.
It's crazy what they did. And so that was a flop, and that really wasn't a good
Mm,
sign. So audiences were wanting something more. It's the late 60s, things are shaking up. Remember how I mentioned that theaters now weren't owned by studios? So this meant that the baby boomers were coming of age. People were going and watching these art house films from all over the world, absorbing how different it was to what they're used to domestically. And domestic studios, they were like, what's going on? What do we do? Also, notably, another movie that decided to go against the code was Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. And that was right before the Hays Code was officially abolished. Bonnie and Clyde really decided to do a full send and go completely against the code, graphic violence. And that's when things started to change. I'm a huge fan of Bonnie and Clyde, by the way. Are you?
yeah, yeah, oh, absolutely, for
I,
sure.
I love it.
That's
I
funny.
need to rewatch
What's
it.
what's really cool though, with what you're talking about, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know this whole timeline of the code and what could be shown, what couldn't be shown. So the fact that Bonnie and Clyde kind of fits right there is really amazing. And this is why we have these conversations,
Yes,
because it really does make you appreciate things even more. You know, things that we probably couldn't have had if people just didn't do it. You know, just say screw
exactly.
the rules and let's just do it. So that's awesome. Yeah, very cool.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it also just, I think, especially for today's chat, makes this movie targets just as well. There's just so much to talk about. Like, I saw this episode as a little mini history lesson.
Sure.
But yeah, so this takes us to 1967 slash 1968. We are now at the birth of New Hollywood. And these movies were more so director driven, they had lower budgets, they were often shot on location, so similar to the New Wave influence from Europe. And they were also very notably anti authoritarian. Those were the themes. Very liberal when it came to sex and drugs and violence. They were political. They were basically very ballsy for the time. And it's an exciting time in Hollywood. You have Scorsese, Coppola, Sidney Lumet, Robert Altman, Mike Nichols. I mean, it goes on and on and on that list. Of course, Bogdanovich, who we're chatting about today. Do you have a favorite new Hollywood filmmaker?
The nerd in me, when you mention some of these names, immediately just goes to George Lucas.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he obviously wasn't making what his friends were making. And so all of the directors you mentioned are on a different level, to be honest. But being a Star Wars fan, but also being a THX 1138 fan, which is Lucas's, I'm pretty sure, first like feature.
Haven't seen it.
Just, just it's it's sci-fi, very weird. With a title like that, it's you know, George just loved doing that. By the way, just randomly titling films, with no connection to what we know as the English language. But of course, THX became very popular, and 1138 became very like fun Easter egg in Star
Wow.
Wars films as well. And so yes, when I think of that crew, immediately I'm thinking about George Lucas and his crazy ideas of a space farmer and a war in space. And yeah, so that's what I think about.
Love it. Love it. So, yeah, New Hollywood. We get this focus as well on outsider protagonists, highlighting counterculture in America. And keep in mind, there's an economic downturn at the time. People didn't trust institutions, inflation sucked, and younger audiences wanted to see their concerns reflected in the movies that they're watching. They wanted to see the country's societal issues on display in these films. Keep in mind that the Vietnam War was also in its final years at the start of New Hollywood. So you have all this stuff going on in the world that's clearly affecting the entire industry as a whole. And yeah, so we see these motifs of crime, both from outsiders who don't have much, but there was also movies that highlighted organized crime too. And all this was being shown. You had films like, Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, Taxi Driver, even The Godfather with a theme of organized crime, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we have targets. And yeah, I mean, it's just an exciting time. So, why did New Hollywood come to an end? Now, I'm going to get into a few things. I hope you're not mad at me for this. We'll be fine. We'll be fine. So, old Hollywood came to an end because of the good old blockbuster. You had movies like Jaws come out, then notably Star Wars. I think many folks point to 1983's Star Wars Return of the Jedi as the quote unquote end of New Hollywood, since it really marked the rise of commercialization in the era of the
Mm,
blockbuster. And
sure.
side note, interestingly enough, you kind of see history repeating itself now, right? People are growing tired of Marvel movies that are being made. I think that's interesting. It makes me wonder what's to come in this exact moment of film history and trends and what people want to see.
The conversation with that, of course, is there's a lot of people who tend to say there's nothing good anymore. There's no good movies anymore, which is just wrong.
Yep.
And I agree. I think we're seeing another shift in mass media, mainstream media, I should say, where people are wanting more. And Dune 2, I just never expected to be as successful. To be honest, like, don't get me wrong, I love Denis, big, massive fan. I love Dune, but Dune 2 was like this weird shift of like, interesting. This is not a Marvel movie yet. It is making a butt ton of money. People are seeing it 6 times in theaters. And even though it's, based on a book, whatever, it's not an original work, it is a shift. And there's definitely something happening. But of course, a ton of indie things that are just skyrocketing, made for super low amounts of money, making 6, 10 times its budget. There's a lot happening, and hopefully people are, yeah, kind of peeling back the mask, maybe pun intended, and finding the gems that I don't think are hidden anymore,
Yeah.
because thanks to social media and people talking and having podcasts and bringing up new and old work that's just super exciting.
I was literally going to say it's super exciting. I couldn't agree with you more. And before we go on, I also want to say in terms of the new Hollywood movement ending, I'm not here coming on here saying like screw Spielberg and Lucas for birthing the
Right.
trend of blockbusters. That's not what I mean at all. I just mean in terms of facts, they created this thing that sold money, big special effects, big marketing campaigns, and the commercialization of all that, action figures, toys, products. It's all marketing. So I think that yeah, that signaled an end to this movement, but was it good? Was it bad? I'm not one to say or throw shade. Anything you want to add to all of this?
No, I unfortunately I am one of those suckers that loves the toys and loves that
Of
movement,
course.
right? And so yeah, it yeah, I almost it's so funny. Like I tend to be one that complains about superhero films or whatever. But, you know, the next Star Wars project that gets announced, I'm like, I'm back. You know, I'm like, feed. Yeah. So there's, I'm not the best when it comes to being pro or against commercialism, unfortunately.
Fair. That's, you know what? I just wish there was room for both because I'm the type of person that will watch literally like so many different genres that I mean, yeah, I think there's room for both. There's pros and cons to both. But
Absolutely.
so, why did I decide to go on this history lesson tangent? Because I think it's important to know for context when watching Targets and seeing why Karloff's character is so done because he realizes that times are changing, audiences are changing. He doesn't feel like he has a place in Hollywood anymore. I think he even says something like, I'm an antique, the world belongs to the young. And it's interesting, actually, according to Bogdanovich, Karloff was very similar to how he was in the movie. But one notable thing was that he wasn't bitter and he wasn't prepared to retire just yet. So I thought that was fascinating, honestly. But yeah, we see more of this history of changing times play out in the movie too. Like, remember how I said there was that rise of TV in the 50s as well, obviously continued into the 60s. We see that in Bobby's home life and what the average American suburban home looked like at the time. There's notably, I don't know if you noticed, in his house, no art on the walls. It's just family photos and there's not much else. It's very barren. And at the end of the night, they just get together in front of the TV and they're just absorbing whatever piece of media or news is being shown on screen. So yeah, does that kind of contextualize things a bit better, all of this?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a great moments when they're driving and I forget the line. It's a really great line, but he's looking out his window, Boris Karloff, and notices just one after the other car lots, and it's just this kind of just sea of cars that are for sale. And he mentioned something about like this town used to be something and now it's just turned into ad after ad and lot after lot of things to buy. So yeah, it's right on the money there for sure.
I love that you brought that up. I wasn't even going to bring up that scene. It totally just flew over my head. And I've
Hmm.
seen the movie twice now, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, sure.
But let's briefly then discuss now the real life inspiration behind the Bobby storyline, since we just explained so much background info on Orlok's storyline. So, how much do you know about Charles Whitman?
I quick Wikipedia. Whoa, what happens? How have I not heard? I'm from Texas, so how have I? And maybe I've heard of it
Wow.
before, but yeah, this is crazy.
It's it's just yeah, I can't believe it. So Charles Whitman, also known as the Texas Tower Sniper, this event was America's first modern mass shooting, from what I was reading, happened on August 1st, 1966. So not too much time had passed before Targets was made, actually, which is probably why Bogdanovich's editor mentioned it. It was fresh in the mind. And I'm going to preface this, I guess, with a trigger warning because all of this is really quite disturbing. But so this happened at the University of Texas in Austin on top of the main tower building. There was an observation deck, and Whitman was 25 at the time. He was a Marine vet, and he just started shooting from this building. I believe he shot and killed 15 people, 31 were injured. I think and yeah, he was killed by the police, I think 96 minutes after he first opened fire. And much like what we see Bobby do in Targets, Whitman first killed his mother and his wife, and he did so to spare them the embarrassment that he knew it would cause them by what he did next. He also notably buried them in quotation marks the same way Bobby did. And I say that because he didn't really bury them, he just tucked their bodies into bed. And so, yeah, it's terrifying. We also know that he made suicide letters, similar again to what we see Bobby do in Targets. And within these letters, it's notable that Whitman also requested an autopsy because he knew he would get shot eventually. And he wanted people to study his brain and see what was wrong with him so the same thing wouldn't happen again. And of course, the same thing has happened again and again and again and again throughout the decades. And there's much to say about Whitman's upbringing and how he was raised, but it's a story for another day. But what I will note is that it's disturbing to think that as a child, he was apparently quiet and polite and intelligent. Then later, when he was a Marine, he earned a sharpshooter's badge and he was a good shot. So all of this is just so chilling to me to think about what happened. Anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, the autopsy came back. I think he did have a tumor that
Yep.
was messing with his mind. And it's terrifying to think that, yeah, you can live this kind of angelic life. And now, granted, I'm sure being in the army messed with them, as tends to happen. In fact, the character in the film, there's only one image, and he's looking at pictures on the wall that shows that he was also in the
Hmm.
armed forces. And once I saw that, I was just like, oh, okay, yeah, that's probably why. I'm sure there's some suppressed PTSD
Oh,
or what
yeah.
have you. But with the real life situation, the fact that this growth in his brain could shift reality, that's terrifying. That
Hmm.
you cannot be in full control of your mind. That's crazy.
Absolutely. I mean, there's also, I was reading stuff to be said about how strict his father was. Apparently, his father wasn't the kindest person, and I guess, pockets of that in Targets with Bobby, but from what I hear, it was also a bit more intense for the actual Charles Whitman. But yeah, so this happens, and when he's on that tower, actually Charles, not Bobby, this was a media frenzy for 90 minutes. Of course, news channels got wind of what was going on, so there were special TV broadcasts. People watched this across the country on their TVs, just horrified. And I mean, as I mentioned at the start, these were real life terrors that really sent shivers down people's spines. Not mummies, not vampires, not that stuff from old Hollywood. And that's why I think this movie is so important too. It's a film that criticizes the accessibility of guns in America. It's a very anti gun movie. And we watch as Bobby just keeps collecting and buying these guns. The movie's literally showing us how terrifying this is. Don't you agree?
Yeah, and it's like way too easy for him to do it too. He writes a
Yeah.
check that I'm sure is going to bounce, and then the next time he buys, I don't know, 300, 500 rounds of ammo, he just charges it to his dad's account. Yeah, just yeah.
It's terrifying. It's also worth noting that Corman produced movies did often carry social justice themes buried within them. And Targets really does have that anti-gun message. If you think about it, even when Orlok goes to stop Bobby, did you notice he does it with his cane? I mean, he also bitch slaps him too, which made me laugh so hard, by the way. But I don't
I
think that that was accidental.
I don't think it ruins the moment, but it did make me like, we just backhanded him. Yeah, but yeah, he
Oh,
first attacks him with the cane,
the
knocks the gun
cane.
out of his hand, and then I forget what's the shooter's name?
Bobby.
Bobby curls up like a baby
Yes.
in the fetal position because he's clearly messed up in the head.
Totally. Yeah. I thought that was such a great way to wrap. But yeah, I also find it interesting that there isn't a score in the movie. We get, of
Mm.
course, the diegetic music in the form of what's playing on the radio, but there isn't a score. And Bogdanovich said that he decided not to use one because he said that there's no reason to use music to tell you what to feel. And I don't know about you, but I found it so chilling. Those moments where Bobby is killing people, notably the first two murders or three that happened in his home, it's pure silence. Bogdanovich holds that scene for an uncomfortably long time. And you watch Bobby go about moving these bodies in silence. You hear the noise from the neighborhood, the birds chirping. That just terrified me. Did it have the same effect on you?
Yeah, absolutely. He also, especially earlier in the film, tends to just let the camera run and walk with the character and move throughout the house with him with, again, no backing music, no score, just the sounds of bodies being moved, and
Oh,
these kind of just long shots that are very effective in horror, where take away the music and just let the camera almost be a character as well, because you never know what's going to be revealed when a camera turns. And yeah, when before he kills his wife and mom, I there were because he goes out to the trunk and grabs a gun, and then walks back into his house. I fully expected multiple moments of someone being shot. And it never happened until it finally did happen. So the tension, once once you introduce a gun, it has to go off. That's the rule. And once a gun was brought into the house, I was just waiting and waiting, and the tension just kept going. And yeah, absolute true terror, done very well.
yeah. I love that you mention the concept of a horror movie as well, because when I first saw this, I think I wrote in my letterbox review that this is a horror movie. It really is. And it's effective. This second rewatch that I had recently, when he shoots his family members, I was still just in the same state of shock that I was the first time, even though I knew it was going to happen. It's
Mm,
just so jarring.
yeah.
And it's also terrifying to think of what was to come a year after Targets came out. Because again, it's a movie that's so ahead of its time. I'm curious if this crossed your mind as you were watching it, but do you remember the scene where Bobby goes to the final gun shop that he visits? And the gun shop owner asks him what is he going to shoot? And Bobby says pigs. Does this make you think of what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, cops, right?
No, but yes,
Okay.
obviously, since that's been used to
Yes. Okay.
describe cops since the 19th century. So, yes, you're right
Right.
there. But what it made me think of immediately was the Manson murders, because they wrote pig in blood
Oh,
on the door of
right.
Sharon
Yes, of
Tate and
course.
Polanski.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I immediately thought Manson family, and those murders happened a mere year after Targets came out. That's just so unsettling to think about. Oof. And of course, bringing up the Manson murders now takes us to another point we both made at the start of the episode, and that's Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I know you said you rewatched it for the podcast. Do you think it's a good companion piece?
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost a little too similar,
Oh,
which, not throwing shade, of course, but you have an actor who is, the career is kind of heading downhill,
South.
no longer believes in himself, despite him still having the talent, some sort of talent or whatever. Meanwhile, another subplot is this Manson family situation that then ties in together. Both, which there's a couple of little smaller storylines throughout, but yeah, it's obviously not shot for shot or anything like that, but very similar, which I think means it's a great double feature.
Mhm,
Just old, it's love letter. This one's a little bit more of a love letter to Hollywood than the other one, than
mhm.
Targets. But yeah, it's all set in the same time, so it totally makes sense.
Totally. Oh, I'm glad you agree. So, for starters, Tarantino is a fan of Targets. Obviously, Bogdanovich as well. He's even written a wonderful review on the film on the New Beverly Cinema blog, which, if you haven't read, definitely do. Those two were very close. They even, get this, they lived together for a time in the 2000s. Bogdanovich lived in Tarantino's guest house for a year, and they would just watch movies together. It's so cute. From what I
That's awesome.
understand, Tarantino said he didn't have targets in his mind when he started mulling about the idea for Once Upon a Time,
Sure.
but it came to him halfway through production. And actually, there is a little homage or a couple in this film. Did you catch either of them?
For Once Upon a Time?
Yeah, four targets in Once Upon a Time. Sorry.
Hmm. I don't think
They're
so.
very subtle. They're subtle. So closer to the start of Once Upon a Time, as Brad Pitt's character is driving home, he passes by a drive-in theater. That's the drive-in theater from Targets, the
Great.
exact same one.
Brilliant. Awesome.
So there's that. Also, pretty quick, you gotta have an eagle eye or eagle ear, I guess. Radio DJ we hear in Cliff's car, that's the same one that plays in Bobby's car. It's 93 KHJ Los Angeles. So I think that's wild.
That's
So
awesome.
such little things, but I think
Yeah.
it's super cool.
No, that's fun.
Right? So I bring up these little Easter eggs, obviously just for fun, but it's always fun to chat about them. But I mean, the major motif is the relationship between Hollywood or pop culture and movies to violence, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. As you said, they're both set around the same time period. Target's obviously set in the year that it was released, 1968, or no, 1967, 1968. Once Upon a Time during a time of the Manson family murders, so 1969. So they're right there, basically. And both films divide their time, as you said, washed up stars, so Karloff and DiCaprio with the violent crime, so Bobby and Target's Manson family and Once Upon a Time. And then they end in kind of the same way. Both of these washed up stars stop the killers. Of course, as you were mentioning, Tarantino leans more into the nostalgia, gives us a fairy tale ending, where Bogdanovich's film is just horror and is more of a warning, let's call it. But that's not to say that he doesn't have love for old Hollywood and the nostalgia that comes with that. Don't you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's that scene with Bogdanovich himself where he's getting drunk with Karloff's character and he's watching, what was it, Howard Hawks's Criminal Code on TV.
hmm
And
hmm
as Orlok is interrupting him, he hushes him because he's loving it so much. And he even declares that it's a Hawks movie on TV. So I think that he has a lot of love for cinema, much like Tarantino. They're very similar in that sense. Is there anything you want to add to this comparison?
Maybe Targets isn't a love letter to Hollywood itself, but it is to the legend of Boris Karloff. Like, it's
Mm.
obviously Boris is playing a fictional version of himself, but these what's being shown on screen are Boris's films and appearances from the past, and
Yes.
the audience is excited to see him. Boris, his character, isn't excited to be him, and but there's a captivated audience who is showing up to the drive-in to see him and potentially meet him, and people are very excited to see a legend, and it's meta because a legend is playing that part very, very well. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that you bring up how excited people seemed in that drive-in to get to see Karloff, because you're so right. One thing I noticed as well is at the drive-in, there were people from all different generations. You had an older
Yeah.
generation coming to watch, you had a younger generation. So that love for him is still there, which that also warmed my heart. There were moments of this movie where I was like, oh, Orlok, Karloff.
Yeah.
But to move along, it's interesting that Bogdanovich made this film and how ahead of its time it was, only to not have the most glowing thoughts about it in the years to come. Do you know about this?
No, I purposely put this off because I knew you would have the spark notes. Yeah,
Oh,
I'm very
it's
interested
yeah.
because I one thing I do know is Paramount put out kind of gun violence
Hmm.
warning, I think, with releases, and he was not a fan of that. So I do know that there's potentially some bad blood happening. So definitely fill me in.
Yeah, so again, more history. Yay. Basically, let's do it this way. I'm trying to think of how to tackle this. A lot happened to Bogdanovich himself in the years after Targets was released. He notably split with his wife, Polly Platt, after he had an affair with Sybil Shepherd, the star of The Last
Wow.
Picture Show. And she was, I mean, she was out to claim men in that movie as well.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
anyway, he had an enormous trauma in the decades that followed. He was dating Dorothy Stratton, and in 1980, she was murdered by her estranged husband. And listeners can read up on that in more detail if they're interested. Bogdanovich also wrote a book chronicling her life, The Killing of the Unicorn. That's the title of the book. But what I'm getting at is he faced a brutal death in his life too. And in 2012, he penned a piece for The Hollywood Reporter in response to, do you remember that movie theater shooting in Colorado? I can't remember where
Mm.
exactly, but
Yeah.
maybe you
Yeah.
remember it. Yeah. So he basically spoke out against on-screen violence and how numb the audience had become, or audiences in general. So Let me read you a quote. It's a small passage that he wrote. He said, "Too much murder and killing. You make people insensitive by showing it all the time. The body count in pictures is huge. It numbs the audience into thinking it's not so terrible." Back in the 70s, I asked Orson Welles what he thought was happening to pictures, and he said, "We're brutalizing the audience. We're going to end up like the Roman circus live at the Colosseum. The respect for human life seems to be eroding." End quote. And so he basically said that he feels sick that he made a movie about such brutality because he believed that violence on screen was getting out of control to the point where it could drive people crazy. What do you make of all of this?
Well, that fits perfectly with Once Upon a Time because that's what one of the killers brings up in the car is they recognize Leo's character and they get back in their car and kind of shift their plans to kill those that taught them how to kill or taught yes it was
Yes.
the way she phrases it, but that's exactly it.
Oh, I'm so happy you bring that up. I didn't even have that for today's chat. Like that didn't even hit me, but you're so right. And yeah, I mean, in that same piece, Bogdanovich for the Hollywood Reporter, he talked about Stratton's murder as well and how horrible that was for him. And what he basically said was it's the showing of murders in movies that bothered him because he saw it as a lack of respect for life. And he mentioned that obviously people were going to show violence in movies, but he believed it should be done without, I think he said, showing people getting blown up, which is interesting that he was so close to Tarantino as well, because that's a man known for his ultra violent movies, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of weird.
Interesting. Yeah.
But I also want to highlight what happened after Targets came out. Did not do well, kind of what you were reading about a little bit. So, a few things that happened were super detrimental to the film's release. First off, Paramount bought the film, as you were saying, and Corman ended up profiting from it before it even came out. That's just a little aside. But so they bought the movie, they scheduled it for release when two tragedies occurred in America right before the release: the murders of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And of course, after that, there's this huge public outcry against violence in general. And this is a bit ironic because Targets was supposed to be seen as a cautionary tale that speaks out against gun violence. But so Paramount is now in a panic. Half of them don't even want to release the film, the other half want to release it right away. So the compromise that they found was to release it in August, and it was a very limited release. And critics liked the movie. They really did. But the general public did not. They were angry at Bobby's character to see this person perform these murders in such a detached way. And the fact that he just looked like your average American man, all of this just hit too close to home, was too realistic, and people did not like that. So yeah, that's kind of my spark notes. Anything you want to add or say?
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. I think it's kind of a cop out to try and shove that away, shove the true
Mm-hmm.
reality. You know, people don't want to see it so that it doesn't exist, but it does exist. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a cop out for people to try and shut down something that reminds them of reality, which is not smart. And you know, if it doesn't happen to me, it doesn't exist is just a bad mindset. And it's so crazy that it still is happening today of people not taking things seriously, mental health being one. You know, that was something that the let me find the guy's name, Charles Whitman, talked
Mm-hmm.
about is if he had any money left over because of his life insurance, he wanted it donated to this to mental health studies. And this is in the 60s. And thankfully, like, mental health is a nice is like a favorable topic that people are constantly kind of bringing up today. So that's nice. We're definitely, I think, heading in a positive direction when it comes to that. But there are still a lot of things that are happening today that people are just saying, like, can you stop talking about that because it's too real? And that's dangerous. I think
Hmm.
it's very, very dangerous to just kind of close your eyes and pretend it's not there.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's why it's so chilling for me to even watch this and think about how little has changed, you know?
Mm.
But yeah, to go back to the movie, apparently, according to Bogdanovich, one main thing he learned from Corman was to not follow the rules. And he still has a lot of love for this movie as well. I should actually pause and make note of that. It's not like he was trash talking it in the decades to come. He has a lot of love for Targets, for Corman as well. He believed that honestly, the Last Picture Show wouldn't have ever happened if it wasn't for Targets or Corman or Karloff. And all these people really did help him. And so, yeah, what the one takeaway, major takeaway for Bogdanovich with Corman was to not follow the rules. So that crazy sequence in Targets on the freeway with Bobby shooting from the tower, that wasn't allowed at the time. Like you weren't allowed to shoot anywhere on or near a freeway, and they just did it anyway, and they somehow got away with it. I think it was done in over 2 days, that sequence, but that's wild. Just to
Yeah.
think as like an aside and how boundary pushing this was thematically, but both also the way it was done.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Targets came out, didn't do that great, but like I said, success was to come in the years that followed, particularly in the 70s with the Last Picture Show. He got two, I don't think he won an Oscar, but he got two Oscar nominations for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay. And get this, I do want to add this as well. I found this interesting. In the 70s, Bogdanovich was offered and he rejected making The Godfather, The Exorcist, and Chinatown, among other high profile films. Wild, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't believe it.
That's rough.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, maybe the movie didn't do well, but what I'm getting at with all this rambling is A, he still had a lot of respect and love for Karloff, for Corman, for this movie, and it just set the stage for his success in the years to come. So, yeah, that's mainly all I had for today's chat. And I mean, my main takeaway for today's conversation was to look at Targets because I know many folks can now watch it on the Criterion channel or they can get physical copies. But to look at it as a movie that's really ahead of its time, also a film that captured what was going on in Hollywood history at that time. It's just all very fascinating to look at from a historical perspective. Did you want to add anything else before parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say from a filmmaking perspective, it's done very well. Do you know the budget?
No, not at the top of my head.
It had to be
I could
low,
look it up.
obviously, with his this being his first project, and
Although it
um
was a Corman feature, right?
yeah, but Corman's also kind of the king of the B movie as well.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Oh,
but
130,000 estimated.
wow.
I mean, if you think
Okay.
about it, a lot of it was reused, or not a lot of it, but they did interlace or interject the terror and then moments from Howard Hawks' movie as well.
So that is even today, that's like not even $1.2 million, which is a
Wow.
cheap movie, super cheap movie today. So that's crazy. But that's
Mm-hmm.
what excites me about watching it while watching it, knowing that it was a lower budget film. What they were able to pull off was amazing, especially the highway, and then
Yes.
finding out that they weren't even allowed to do it, knowing that because those cars are like weaving in traffic because
I
they got
know.
shot. And so, yeah, to see what they were able to pull off, because that's what I love whenever I
Hmm.
approach a film, especially with a low budget, is to see what people can pull off with nothing essentially. And so this, like I said, I would expect a single location, small cast, but to see how big this movie is, it's really quite large, especially at the ends, with a whole
Yes.
crowd of people for the drive-in. So really impressive from a filmmaking perspective. It's his first film, which is also amazing. Yeah, it's by all means absolutely watch it, and then watch Once Upon a Time after to maybe lift your spirits a little bit.
I was gonna say, yeah. No, you're right. I did want to bring up, I forgot to mention it earlier. Do you know, I was reading the special or watching the special features, that crowd at the drive-in, there actually wasn't that many people. That was all editing. They did not have that many cars or people. And it was just, I guess, the power of
Just
the way they shot it.
sure that yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess technically you only really need people in that front row.
Oh, yeah, that's
Lighting
true.
could, not see past, maybe three rows of cars. Yeah, that actually doesn't surprise me.
Oh, I was
Yeah,
surprised.
they killed that. No, no, no,
Yeah.
like what I mean though is like it makes
You have
sense
more
if you had to
insight.
approach
Yeah,
it
yeah.
that way. Yeah, if you had to approach it that way. Oh yeah, actually, it does make sense that there's not that many people there because you probably couldn't afford it. So no, that's very cool
Yeah.
for sure.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming back on the pod for this
Of
chat.
course.
Do you want to shout out your socials or projects or anything at all?
B-Star Cinema across the boards. Something exciting happening in my life is I'm going to San Diego Comic-Con in July, and that's a childhood dream, and
Wow.
I don't even know what to expect. The fact that I even get to be in California during that time is amazing, but the fact that I get to go and just be there and be present is very, very exciting for sure. So definitely expect content surrounding that on all of those platforms.
Oh, amazing. Yes, everybody, please follow Brian. He has fantastic content both on TikTok and Instagram. Do you have a YouTube as well, or
I do,
no?
yeah.
Yeah, you
I
do.
need to get back to it.
Well, we'll be here for all of that, and I would love to have you come back on whenever you want. So it's always a
Of
pleasure.
course. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Brian.
Fantastic being here. Thank you.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.